September 20th, 1943. The relentless Texas sun bore down on the long, steel body of a troop train as it groaned and hissed, shuddering to a complete stop in the desolate expanse of what felt like nowhere. Small dust devils swirled beneath its massive wheels, dancing around the worn boots, simple skirts, and rifles of those disembarking. The first to step onto the parched earth were not men, but women, gaunt, pallid, and utterly exhausted figures. They were cloaked in what remained of the gray-green uniforms of Mussolini's auxiliary corps. Their hair was matted and stiff from weeks spent at sea, their faces hardened by suspicion. They squinted through the blinding glare, their minds bracing for the sight of grim prison walls or the snarls of guard dogs. Instead, their eyes met endless cotton fields stretching toward the distant horizon and a crude wooden sign painted in English, a language they could not decipher. A few managed to catch a word or two, a fragment of recognition. Welcome, they heard, and then, prisoners of war. For months leading up to this moment, these women had been living within the very fabric of a war that was rapidly unraveling. They had served as nurses amidst bombed-out hospitals, radio clerks in crumbling command posts, or Red Cross attendants patching the wounded with whatever rags they could find. Italy's surrender a mere 11 days prior had not only fractured their nation and its army, but had also split their deepest loyalties. Some still dared to whisper, "Viva Duce," beneath their breath, while others prayed no one would ever hear them utter his name. Now, their arduous journey had concluded deep within the heart of America, the very land they had been indoctrinated to fear. Propaganda leaflets had painted it as a place of crass materialism, godlessness, and cruelty. Here, the air was a strange blend of hot iron, pungent pine resin, and an unidentified sweetness, the inviting scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the camp kitchens. An American lieutenant, his voice booming, shouted for them to form a line. His southern drawl stretched the English words like warm syrup, but his gestures were unambiguous enough. Line up, single file. Keep moving. The women complied, clutching their meager bundles. A comb, a few precious letters, a rosary or two. One nurse, perhaps no older than 24, murmured to her companion, "We will be punished now. The Allies, they hate us." Another, older and etched with more profound weariness, whispered back, "At least they let us stand." A truck rattled past, its barrels spilling water onto the dusty ground. For a startled moment, the women froze at the sight. Water, so mundane, so abundantly available here that it could be casually wasted on dust. Back home, water had been severely rationed, often brown and lukewarm from ruptured pipes. Even in their profound fear, this stark contrast struck them like a silent, crushing insult. Inside the camp gate, U.S. guards stood in crisp, clean khaki uniforms, their faces young, tanned by the sun, and almost disarmingly bored. No one hurled insults. No one spat. A bugle call echoed somewhere high above, a clear, bright, and surprisingly cheerful sound. To the women's utter confusion, there were even flowers planted near the barracks, marigolds glowing vividly in the intense heat. It was as if the place itself had not yet grasped its true nature as a prison. The narrator's tone softens, delving into a forgotten corner of history. What these women couldn't possibly know, what history itself had nearly overlooked, was that by late 1943, the United States was holding over 50,000 Italian prisoners, dispersed across camps from Virginia to California. Among them were a few thousand women, clerks, auxiliaries, volunteers, sent not for retribution, but for containment. They were processed under the very same Geneva Convention that guaranteed humane treatment to soldiers. Yet, those reassuring words, humane treatment, held little meaning for anyone who had witnessed the corrosive power of hunger on human dignity. The line of women shuffled slowly toward a long wooden building with a network of metal pipes running along its side. Wisps of steam leaked lazily from vents. A stark white sign above the door simply read, "Decontamination." The word caused some of the women to stiffen, their bodies tensing. They had heard chilling stories, fragmented rumors smuggled from German soldiers, of chemical showers, of torture, of ultimate humiliation. Their hearts began to pound faster. A woman at the front hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "They are going to clean us like animals." Outside, Sergeant James Holloway of the U.S. Army Medical Corps meticulously ticked names off a clipboard. He was a mere 23, an Arkansas native, a barber before the draft had pulled him into the war. To him, these Italian women looked like spectral figures, starved, covered in dust, far too young for the horrors of war. "Don't worry, ladies," he offered, attempting a half-smile they couldn't comprehend. "You'll feel better after." He waved one woman forward, gesturing toward the pipes. Inside, the air shimmered with oppressive heat. The narrator leans in, almost whispering. They expected punishment, not perfume. Each woman stepped inside as though entering a tomb. The walls were tiled, remarkably clean, and carried a faint metallic scent. They were handed soft towels, small, unassuming cakes of soap stamped U.S. Army issue, and instructed to wait. When the valves finally opened, hot water burst from the nozzles, hissing like a collective, released breath. The initial screams were pure reflex, raw fear colliding with utter surprise, quickly followed by nervous laughter, then wild, contagious peals of it. For the first time in years, real heat, real steam, and real soap touched their skin. It was not a delousing. It was, in that moment, salvation. Outside, Holloway scratched his head, listening to the unexpected laughter through the walls. "Guess they like it," he mused. Another guard nearby responded, "Wouldn't you? Beats a foxhole." When the women emerged, wrapped in towels and trailing steam, their eyes were wide, their cheeks flushed with color, and their hair dark and dripping. One reached instinctively for her friend's hand, whispering, "It smells like flowers." Another blinked slowly at the light, murmuring, "No one has ever washed me without shouting." The interpreter, an Italian-American corporal named Duca, heard her words and offered a faint smile. "Welcome to Texas," he said, speaking in their native tongue. That evening, the women were issued plain cotton dresses, a stew thick with beans, and coffee so robust it stung their tongues. They ate in silence at first, hesitant, almost afraid to believe this reality was true. One woman asked permission to bless the meal. The guards simply nodded. Afterward, a few women began to sing, a low, melancholic hum from their distant homeland. The guards listened, politely pretending not to. By midnight, the camp lights glowed softly, like scattered stars across the vast, open prairie. In the barracks, the women lay on clean mattresses, a luxury they hadn't known in months. Their skin still carried the faint, comforting scent of lemon-scented soap, their hair the unfamiliar fragrance of American shampoo. Some wept softly, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming, almost unbearable gentleness of it all. They had braced themselves for hatred, and instead, they had encountered something utterly disarming: courtesy. In the profound quiet, one nurse recorded a note in her diary, an entry that remarkably survives today in an Italian archive. "I thought America would strip us of our humanity. Instead, they gave it back one shower at a time." The narrator pauses, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. It is here he suggests that the story's true conflict begins not between warring nations, but between opposing ideas. What truly happens when mercy unexpectedly supplants vengeance? What is the profound psychological impact when an enemy's kindness feels more unsettling, more disarming, than his expected cruelty? Outside, a desert wind swept through the camp fence, rattling tin cups and the ropes of distant flagpoles. Sergeant Holloway, having finished his cigarette, stubbed it out and gazed toward the dark horizon. "We'll get Em to work tomorrow," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying on the wind. But tonight let 'em rest. He then switched off the lights. Inside the barracks, a few women whispered prayers in Italian. Others simply stared up at the ceiling, their eyes tracing the elusive shadows cast by the wooden beams. Somewhere, a train whistle echoed, its mournful sound fading into the endless plains, carrying with it the last fragments of a Europe that, for them, no longer truly existed. The narrator's voice returns, quiet, yet edged with profound wonder. They had crossed an ocean expecting the harshest punishment. What they found, instead, was the first warm water in years and a question that history still struggles to fully answer. Asterisk, why did the enemy show them mercy? Asterisk, the sound gradually fades to the slow, steady hiss of steam and a woman's soft laughter, almost like the ghost of a memory desperately trying to survive the ravages of war. The next morning began, not with the shrill call of a trumpet, but with the prosaic clang of metal buckets. Dawn seeped slowly over the barbed wire, bathing the camp in a pale amber light. The women were still groggy, a sharp hiss split the air, followed by the sudden roar of hot water gushing from every nozzle. The women flinched, cried out, instinctively covering their heads. For a single, agonizing heartbeat, panic gripped the room. Then, as the reassuring heat enveloped their skin, disbelief slowly began to replace fear. One woman, a nurse named Lucia, stood motionless, eyes closed, her hands trembling beneath the cascade. She hadn't felt warmth like this since Naples, before the bombs had fallen, before the gnawing hunger. Her hair, once caked with salt and dust, turned glistening black again under the water. She caught her reflection in the wet tile, a foreign face, younger, almost vibrantly alive. The narrator's tone softens once more. Asterisk, they came expecting humiliation. They found something even harder to endure. Kindness. The water ran fragrant, infused with American-supplied shampoo, a faint, pleasing blend of lemon and lavender that filled the air. Someone gasped. Another began to laugh. A sharp, bright sound that spread through the room like a contagion. Within minutes, the place was filled with laughter and splashing, with women shouting words of sheer disbelief, unadulterated joy, and something dangerously close to gratitude. Outside, Holloway paused his clipboard work and peered through the window. Steam blurred the glass. "What the hell's so funny?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Duca grind. They just realized it's hot water." Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Ain't they had that before?" Duca shook his head. "Not like this. Not for years." The entire scene unfolded like an unintentional baptism. Every movement within that steamy room carried the awkward holiness of rediscovery. How to wash, how to breathe deeply, how to simply exist without the constant gnawing fear. A young Red Cross aide, with golden hair neatly tucked under her cap, handed out soft towels and small bottles labeled shampoo, hair, citrus, type A. To the Italian women, these bottles looked absurdly luxurious, like something conjured from a dream. "I thought Americans were savages," one woman said in heavily accented English, holding up her bottle. The aide smiled, not fully understanding the words, but sensing the gentle tone. "Yes, ma'am. Everyone gets one." There were tears too, quiet, utterly unplanned. One matronly woman named Rosa broke down completely, pressing her wet hands to her face. "My son," she sobbed, seemingly to no one. "He hasn't seen water like this since the war began." The nearby guard hesitated, unsure whether to offer comfort. Instead, he made a small, hesitant gesture. A fresh towel, folded neatly. She took it like a sacred relic. By mid-morning, the first group emerged from the building, utterly transformed. The women's hair gleamed in the sun. Their faces were clean, their postures perceptibly lighter. They looked like themselves again. Nurses, mothers, students, not merely prisoners of a collapsed empire. The guards tried not to stare, but even they felt the palpable shift. Holloway, wiping his brow, muttered, "Never thought I'd see smiles in a POW camp." The narrator continues, balancing historical fact with poignant poetry. According to U.S. Army records from 1943, each prisoner was indeed entitled to 1 shower per week, 1 bar of soap per month, and a medical inspection every 10 days. But statistics alone cannot truly measure what it meant to someone who had completely forgotten her own natural scent. For these women, it was not merely about cleanliness. It was about dignity, meticulously returned in streams of steam and lemon-scented water. They lingered near the shower house afterward, hair wrapped in towels, speaking in low, hushed voices. Some dared to ask the guards hesitant questions. "Is this really America? Do they make this soap here?" One guard, too young to remember anything but war, laughed nervously. "Ma'am, it's standard issue." In the barracks, the new clothes awaited. Plain cotton dresses, khaki work skirts, shoes without holes. A small box beside each bunk contained a toothbrush, a comb, and a folded note, written simply in English, "Property of U.S. Army Quartermaster Service." It was as though the enemy had not just conquered them, but had, in some strange, profound way, adopted them. For a brief, disorienting moment, suspicion melted into something far more dangerous: trust. That night, the women sang softly again, not out of duty, but out of pure, unbidden instinct. Their voices drifted beyond the fences, carried by the warm Texas wind. A few American soldiers stopped their card games to listen. One whispered, "Never heard Italian sound that sad and that pretty at the same time." The narrator's voice slips into a subtle irony. Asterisk propaganda had promised these women that Americans were beasts, but beasts rarely hand out shampoo. Still, not everyone believed this fragile truce would last. Some whispered that this was only the beginning of another kind of war, a war for their very minds. "They want us to love them," Lucia said, toweling her hair dry. "So we forget who we were," Rosa replied softly. "Then maybe it is good to forget a little." In the mess hall that evening, coffee steamed from metal mugs, strong enough to make eyes water. The guards generously allowed seconds. Someone joked, "Perhaps tomorrow they will give us perfume." The laughter that followed was not mocking, but utterly human, fragile, and vibrantly alive. When the lights dimmed, Duca walked the camp perimeter, his shadow stretching long and distorted along the wire. He looked back at the shower building, now silent and dark. Steam still leaked faintly from its roof, curling into the moonlight like smoke from an invisible fire. He thought of the words his captain had spoken that morning. "The Geneva Convention keeps us human." Yet, watching those women, he wondered if decency itself was not the stronger weapon, that soft power that could conquer without firing a single shot. Inside the barracks, Lucia penned another line in her diary. "Careful in the dark, we laughed in captivity. That is the strangest miracle of all." Outside, the wind carried the faint, mingled scent of soap and wet linen across the vast Texas plain. It blended with dust, the dry fragrance of cotton, and the distant, mournful whistle of another train arriving. New prisoners, new stories, new disbelief, all waiting to be washed clean. The narrator's final whisper cuts through the hum of crickets, a profound hush. Asterisk what they thought would break them instead began to mend them. But mercy, like war, has its own consequences, and soon both sides would learn how powerful simple kindness could truly be. Yet peace, as delicate as freshly baked bread, remains a precarious thing, and with each passing day, a new hunger for its sustenance will inevitably arise. By the spring of 1944, the harsh reality of the barbed wire began to soften, no longer appearing solely as a prison fence but rather as a distinct border, a tangible line separating two vastly different worlds. On one side, the Italian women draped their freshly washed dresses over the wire, their laughter carried by the wind as it playfully snatched a sleeve or a stray sock. On the other, American guards, rifles propped against their shoulders, stood watch, a quiet struggle visible in their attempts to suppress a smile. While the brutal tides of war still raged fiercely across distant Italy, here in the unexpected quiet of Texas, the conflict had undergone a curious transformation, becoming strangely domestic. It was no longer solely about defined enemies and battle lines, but rather about shared chores, whispered recipes, and a burgeoning, unspoken understanding. Lucia's English had progressed, now a halting yet earnest language forged from daily work and careful imitation. She could confidently utter polite greetings like, "Good morning, thank you kindly," and with a playful, teasing grin, even chide Margaret, "Don't burn the bread again." She worked diligently beside Margaret Holloway every day, and from this shared labor, something far deeper than mere routine had blossomed. A fragile friendship, delicately stitched together with small gestures and profound, mutual empathy. Margaret often brought her small, thoughtful gifts. A packet of sewing needles, a practical comb, or sometimes a carefully folded magazine picture showcasing elegant dresses, a silent promise of a future beyond the war. In return, Lucia shared the lyrical beauty of Italian lullabies. Words Margaret couldn't quite pronounce but hummed along to nonetheless, finding comfort in their unfamiliar melody. The camp had softened in other, more subtle ways as well. The guards no longer flinched or looked away when the women's voices rose in song during the evenings. Sometimes, their own low voices would tentatively join in, blending awkwardly yet sincerely with the lilting Italian hymns. The very fence that had once stood as a stark divider between conqueror and captive had, by degrees, transformed into a peculiar meeting ground, a place for shared conversation and even unexpected laughter. And yet, despite all this burgeoning warmth and fragile connection, a fundamental question still lingered, an unspoken tremor beneath the surface. How long could such an improbable peace truly endure in the relentless shadow of war? Then, one crisp morning, news arrived that German prisoners of war would be transferred to a nearby facility. The atmosphere within the camp shifted immediately, a palpable tension replacing the earlier ease. Heavy trucks rattled through the gate, bringing with them a new cohort. Stern, often wounded men in crisp gray uniforms, their faces sharp with unspoken pride, their eyes hard with defiance. The Italian women watched from the laundry yard, their earlier chatter silenced. "They look like statues," Rosa observed softly, a chill in her voice. "Stone doesn't melt." Lucia nodded gravely in agreement, adding, "Nor forgive." Later that same week, 2 German officers brazenly refused to work alongside the Italians, contemptuously calling them traitors. When word of this blatant insult spread, a new, unsettling tension crackled visibly through the camp. The American guards, determined to maintain order and prevent further conflict, quickly separated the groups. But the bitter insult had already done its corrosive work. For the first time in months, the familiar sound of the women's laughter vanished. They sat silent at dinner, their gazes fixed on their food, the steam from their bowls curling upward like a fragile, fading hope. That night, Lucia found sleep impossible. She stood by the barracks window, watching the stark floodlights relentlessly trace the barbed wire, feeling a profound ache, the vast distance between herself and her distant home, between Italy's perceived shame and America's unexpected mercy. Her sense of loyalty had become a bewildering puzzle she couldn't solve. Could she truly remain Italian, she wondered, if the very people who offered her kindness wore the uniforms of the enemy? The narrator's tone deepens, a somber reflection. War, it suggests, does not merely conclude when the guns fall silent. True peace, rather, begins when people learn which essential parts of themselves to preserve and which to let go. Days stretched into weeks, until Easter Sunday dawned. Margaret entered the barracks early that morning, carrying a basket carefully covered with a pristine white cloth. The women gathered, their curiosity piqued. Margaret gently lifted the cloth, revealing a heartwarming sight. Still warm rolls, vibrant dyed eggs, and a small chocolate bar, thoughtfully cut into individual pieces. A gift, she stated simply, offered by the kind wives from town. The women stared in stunned disbelief.
Rosa, overcome, quietly crossed herself.
Lucia, too moved to speak, slowly reached for one of the colored eggs, its hue a serene blue like the vast spring sky. That evening, the makeshift chapel tent was filled to capacity. Italians, Americans, and even a few of the newly arrived Germans sat side by side, a silent, improbable congregation, as a chaplain read a verse speaking of forgiveness. The wind rustled gently through the open flaps, carrying with it the sweet, clean scent of wildflowers. When the hymn began, the voices rose, blending imperfectly yet earnestly. English words and Italian syllables tangled together, at times discordant, at others harmonious, until they merged into one uncertain but undeniably beautiful sound. Sergeant Holloway stood at the back, his hands clasped, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Afterward, as the camp began to quiet, Lucia approached him, Duca at her side to translate. "Sergeant," she began carefully, her voice soft, "we thank you for the bread, for the water." She paused, searching for the precise English word, then found it more powerfully expressed in her own tongue. "For dignity." Holloway nodded, his voice rough with emotion. "It ain't charity, miss, just decency. Everyone deserves that much." For weeks afterward, the resonant memory of that Easter night lingered throughout the camp. The guards spoke with a newfound softness. The women worked with perceptibly lighter hearts. The German prisoners, witnessing this strange, evolving coexistence, maintained their distance, perhaps out of envy or confusion. And somewhere in the delicate space between established routine and unexpected grace, the once rigid line separating prisoner and host blurred completely. As Duca meticulously noted in his final report, "They no longer call this a camp, they call it a village, but peace is a guest that never stays long." Then, in July, an official order arrived from Washington. All Italian prisoners deemed cooperators were to be either repatriated to Italy or transferred for labor support elsewhere. The news struck the camp like a sudden thunderclap. Some women cheered with relief at the thought of finally going home. Others wept quietly, their joy tempered by a profound fear of returning to a land of ruins and anticipated judgment. That evening, Lucia found Margaret outside the kitchen, drying her hands slowly. "We go soon," Lucia said softly, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. Margaret looked at her, her eyes shining with unshed tears but also weary. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick. "The war's moving on, honey, but it doesn't mean goodbye forever." She pressed a small, smooth object into Lucia's palm, a tiny bottle of the lemon shampoo they both cherished. "For when you get home," she said gently, "so you don't forget that clean start we made." The simple, tender gesture undid Lucia completely. She hugged Margaret tightly, a spontaneous embrace neither had dared before. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Around them, in that poignant silence, the world seemed to hold the combined sense of fresh bread, clean soap, and quiet tears. Departure day arrived under a heavy, overcast sky. The women lined up by the gate once more, a solemn procession, just as they had on that anxious first morning, months ago. But this time, their faces were noticeably fuller, their clothes freshly pressed, their hair shining with care. They looked, unmistakably, like people reborn. The American guards saluted formally as the trucks slowly rolled out. Margaret waved her handkerchief until it was a blur. Sergeant Holloway stood silently beside her, his jaw set tight, his gaze distant. Lucia looked back, her eyes fixed on the receding camp until it vanished behind a cloud of Texas dust. She slowly opened her palm, where the small shampoo bottle gleamed in the sunlight, a tangible relic of another, unexpected life. The narrator's voice deepens, imbued with gravitas. "History, it reminds us, often fails to record every quiet kindness. Instead, it meticulously chronicles battles, formal treaties, and unfurling flags. But sometimes, it is the quietest moments of bread shared across a divide, hair washed clean with a shared soap, a name spoken gently in recognition, that truly reshape the profound meaning of war. Months later, back in a ravaged Italy, Lucia would carefully unpack her few belongings within the half-collapsed walls of her home. She would place the small bottle reverently on the windowsill, next to a simple loaf of coarse bread. Neighbors would inevitably inquire about her time in America, expecting harrowing tales of hardship. But she would only offer one simple, profound truth. They treated us like people. That, she would say, was enough. Years gently passed. Eventually, letters began to arrive from Texas, one from Margaret, another from Duca. Each envelope held precious photographs. Smiling faces, a familiar camp gate, vibrant marigolds blooming riotously where the harsh barbed wire once stood. The narrator's voice softens, almost fading into a whisper. When the war finally ended, the camp was systematically dismantled. Its buildings were sold off, its fences cut down, erasing its physical presence. Only the very ground beneath their feet, perhaps, remembered where the joyous sound of laughter had once defiantly risen, challenging the rigid logic of hate. In the final, lingering image, the camera settles on an empty shower room. A shaft of sunlight streams through a broken window, illuminating dust motes that drift lazily through the air, glowing like the ghosts of steam. A single, forgotten towel hangs motionless from a hook. The narrator whispers, her voice filled with quiet awe. They came as prisoners. They left as witnesses to a profound victory that required no surrender, only compassion. A poignant pause hangs in the air. Then the voice returns one last time, gentle, deliberate, and deeply human. If stories like this remind you that kindness holds the power to change history, we invite you to leave a like, subscribe, and tell us. What small mercy would you never forget? Because sometimes, the voice concludes, a note of quiet conviction. The smallest acts possess the power to wash away the deepest, most entrenched wars.